In the winter of 1812, 15 children vanished from a small frontier settlement in what is now southern Illinois. And the mystery was far more sinister than wild animals or Indian raids as the militia first assumed. These disappearances were deliberate, orchestrated by the very people entrusted with the children's education and moral upbringing. For 3 years, the Kensington family respected educators who ran the Prairie View Academy, hid a darkness so profound that when it finally came to light, the territorial authorities buried the truth, sealing records and scattering witnesses. The entire case would have been lost to time if not for the dying confession of one escaped child whose last whispered words to her mother revealed a network of ritualistic killings masquerading as religious schooling. The government acted swiftly, destroying evidence, relocating survivors, and ensuring the public would never know the details of what the sealed documents later called the Prairie View Incident. Before we continue with the Kensingtons and their twisted legacy, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're listening from as we uncover a story pieced together from fragments of hidden journals, survivor testimony, and long-suppressed court records. This nightmare began with hope, not horror, as parents desperate for their children's future placed their trust in a family that promised education and faith in a dangerous, isolated land. In 1812, Illinois was a harsh frontier of about 200 settlers on the banks of the Sangamon River, families from Kentucky and Tennessee, seeking better soil and escape from the mounting tensions that would soon erupt into the War of 1812. Life revolved around survival log cabins linked by muddy tracks. Jeremiah Caldwell's general store doubling as a meeting hall, and a Methodist chapel where circuit preacher Samuel Hayes arrived when weather and danger allowed. Education was a rare luxury. The nearest school was 60 miles away in Kaskaskia, a journey few could afford, leaving most children barely literate, if at all. When Cornelius and Matilda Kensington arrived in 1809, they seemed like an answer to prayer. Cornelius, tall and gaunt with a preacher's voice and knowledge of Scripture, Latin and Greek, claimed to have left seminary in Pennsylvania after a divine vision called him to bring learning to the wilderness. Matilda, sharp-eyed and severe, taught with patience and skill, and together they promised an education equal to anything back east. Their twin sons, Jeremiah and Josiah, thin and unsettlingly identical, served as assistants and disciplinarians, speaking almost always in unison. Letters of recommendation, impressive but vague, preceded them, and by spring 1809, the Kensingtons had convinced the community that their mission was holy. On a hill overlooking Prairie View, they built a 2-story academy with 24 rooms, dormitories, classrooms, a chapel, and their own living quarters. Most of the men in the settlement helped build it trading labor for tuition, believing they had secured a better future for their children. But behind the thick log walls and windowless rooms, a much darker purpose was taking root. By the winter of 1811, Prairie View Academy had become the pride of 3 counties. The Kensingtons accepted both day students and boarders, charging modest fees that struggling farmers could afford with cash, grain, livestock, or labor. This generosity opened a world of learning for families who had never dreamed their children could study reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, natural philosophy, Latin, and Scripture in one place, an education rivaling schools in the East. Word of the academy spread through trading posts, churches, and family networks. Parents moved closer to the settlement, and many arranged for their children to board through the winter months when farm work slowed. Cornelius Kensington was known for his long prayers and strict but inspiring chapel services, where he preached obedient sacrifice and devotion to God. Matilda, with her patient and innovative methods, taught literacy and domestic skills, using farm life as her lesson book. Even the pale and silent twin sons Jeremiah and Josiah earned a curious respect for their ability to keep order without a whip. Instead of punishment, they led private talks on morality that left misbehaving children solemn and compliant. By the end of 1811, over 30 students boarded at the academy, their parents grateful for both the education and the relief from winter hardship. But the trust that bound this community to the Kensington family hid a terrible truth. The facade they had built was flawless, a careful mask crafted to win over a people desperate to believe in salvation. No one suspected the danger until November 23, 1811, when 12-year-old Samuel Hartwell failed to come home for Thanksgiving. Samuel, son of a blacksmith from Cedar Creek, had been at the academy since October and wrote cheerful letters about his studies. When he did not return as planned, his father William assumed weather delays. Autumn storms had made travel dangerous. After 3 more days without word, William saddled his horse and rode the 20 miles to Prairie View through freezing mud and snow. He arrived as the sun sank behind the hills, the academy glowing warm and welcoming hymns drifting from its windows. At first sight, nothing seemed amiss. Then Cornelius Kensington came to meet him. The tall, gray-eyed man who once seemed unshakable now looked stricken, his hands trembling as he offered them in sympathy. "Brother Hartwell," he said in a voice thick with sorrow, "I fear the Lord has called your Samuel home to his eternal reward." He spoke of a sudden fever that had struck 3 days before Matilda's sleepless vigil by the boy's bed, their prayers, and Samuel's peaceful passing whispering for his parents at the end. The storms, Cornelius explained, had made it impossible to send word. By the time the weather cleared, they had already buried Samuel in the family plot behind the chapel to spare his small body from decay, laying him to rest with a Christian service. William listened numb as the world around him seemed to tilt and collapse, never suspecting that this would be the first of many children to vanish behind the walls of Prairie View Academy. Matilda appeared beside her husband with tears in her eyes and said softly, "We've been praying for your family's comfort." Samuel was such a bright, godly boy. His final words were of gratitude for the education he'd been given and of his love for Jesus, even in those last hard hours. Crushed by grief, William Hartwell found no reason to doubt her sincerity. On the frontier, sudden fevers claimed children with frightening frequency, and the Kensington's sorrow seemed genuine. The small wooden cross over Samuel's grave behind the chapel, the careful carving of his name and a simple inscription, "Beloved student now with Jesus," along with a bundle of his belongings and a lock of hair tied with a blue ribbon, convinced William that his son had been treated with care. The blacksmith rode home heartbroken but resigned, thankful at least that Samuel's last months had been spent learning and living in a place of faith. Over the following months, however, more deaths followed the same pattern. In December, 10-year-old Mary Patterson from Hickory Grove died of what Cornelius called brain fever, her parents receiving a letter and the small prayer book she had held during her final days. In January, 14-year-old Joseph Fletcher from Sugar Creek was said to have died of consumption. His grieving father sent a wooden angel Joseph had carved as a Christmas gift. February claimed 8-year-old Rebecca Martinez, who had traveled nearly 40 miles for the academy's special instruction. Bad weather kept her parents away, so the Kensingtons held the funeral themselves and sent a long letter filled with quotes from her supposed prayers. March brought the worst blow brothers David and Andrew Kelly, 11 and 13, who died within days of each other from the same sudden fever that had taken Samuel. They were buried side by side, just as they had asked, so they could continue their studies together in heaven. Each time, the Kensingtons showed deep sorrow, held proper Christian burials, and refused payment for funeral costs. They offered grieving parents tokens, a favorite book, a wooden cross, a lock of hair. Yet by the summer of 1812, whispers had begun to circulate. These tragedies had only touched boarding students, never day students, and always occurred during the long, quiet stretches when most other children had dining home to help with planting or harvest. And every child lost was a gifted one, Samuel quick with numbers and letters, Mary with her gift for music and languages, Joseph an artist, Rebecca far ahead in reading, and the Kelly brothers full of promise. Among the parents who began to worry was Martha Prescott. Her 10-year-old daughter Anne had been at the academy since September, and her letters had grown unsettling. Anne wrote of new students who seemed to arrive and then vanish, of strange crying at night, the Kensingtons brushed off as the wind, and of basement lessons where they learned subjects she was forbidden to describe. Even more troubling, she wrote of how cheerful children slowly turned pale, withdrawn, and fearful. How they became strangely obedient, yet cried when no one was watching. Martha read these letters with a growing dread, realizing too late that her daughter's voice was the first warning of something far darker than illness. At first, Martha Prescott dismissed her daughter Anne's letters as homesickness, but the more Anne wrote, the darker and more detailed her descriptions became. She spoke of strange ceremonies held in the basement chapel of classmates who were chosen for advanced lessons and never returned, of the twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, who never stopped watching and who reported every word and movement to their parents. By early December, Martha's worry overcame her patience. She rode to Prairie View, determined to bring Anne home for Christmas. The academy, usually alive with the noise of 24 children, was silent. No laughter, no lessons, just a heavy stillness that clung to the walls. Matilda greeted her at the door with her well-practiced air of sorrow, wringing her hands and avoiding her gaze. "Anne has taken ill," she said softly. "The same fever that took Samuel and the others. It came on suddenly last night. She's weak, delirious. Best you come back in a few days when she's stronger." But Martha had spent weeks with a growing sense of dread, and she saw through the rehearsed kindness. Without a word, she pushed past Matilda into the hall and called for her daughter. From deep inside the building came a weak, terrified cry. "Mama, help me, Mama." A door slammed. Footsteps pounded the wooden floors, and the fear in that voice left no room for doubt. Martha ran toward the sound, Matilda's protests following her. Cornelius appeared from the back, his usual composure gone, hair mussed, hands shaking as he tried to block her path. "Mrs. Prescott, please, you must understand," he said, voice strained. "Anne is delirious. Fever makes children imagine terrible things. She might say things that will only upset you." But Martha had heard the terror in her daughter's voice, and she was not about to be turned away. She pushed forward, heading for the stairs, as Cornelius and Matilda trailed after her, their explanation sounding increasingly desperate. The twins emerged and stood silently at the bottom step, pale and still, their watchful eyes fixed on her like sentries. The standoff dragged on, Martha demanding to see Anne, the Kensingtons insisting it would harm the child, until Anne's voice rose again, more frantic than before. "Mama, don't let them take me to the basement again. Please don't leave me here." That single sentence shattered the last of Martha's restraint. She had read about the basement in Anne's letters, but the terror in her voice turned suspicion into certainty. Martha swore that if she wasn't allowed to see her daughter immediately, she would return with the territorial sheriff and demand a full investigation. Faced with exposure, the Kensingtons finally gave in. With visible reluctance, they led her up the stairs to a small room. The sight that met Martha's eyes stole her breath. Anne was pale thin and shaking her small hands, gripping her mother's with desperate strength. There was no fever, only raw fear. Her wide eyes darted toward the Kensingtons, as if expecting them to drag her away. "She's been like this since the fever broke," Matilda said, her voice unsteady. "Dr. Coleman from Kaskaskia recommends rest. She's confused, frightened." But Martha saw the truth immediately. Her daughter wasn't sick. She was terrified of what had been happening behind those closed doors. Martha knew at once that Anne was not sick, but terrified. Her daughter's hand clung tightly to her own. Her eyes were clear, and every whisper was lucid. When Martha said they were leaving, Anne's soft reply froze her blood. "They're not all buried in the cemetery. Some of them are still in the basement." The ride home through the dark was wordless, except for Anne's frightened glances behind them and the occasional whimper that escaped her lips. Safe inside their cabin, with the door barred and a quilt pulled tight around her small frame, Anne began to speak. Her story came out slowly, broken by tears. She told of lessons in the basement chapel where Cornelius taught a select few about obedient sacrifice and how children were chosen for a divine purpose. The brightest among them were called for private lessons at night while others slept. These gatherings became covenant rituals held in a stone room beneath the chapel. Before each ceremony, Cornelius gave them a bitter drink that made them sleepy and compliant. What happened next? Anne only half remembered her thoughts, clouded by the mixture. She recalled prayers, sermons, and a feeling of being watched. Afterwards, some students never returned. When their absence was questioned, the Kensingtons would say those chosen had been sent on missions to spread God's word in far-off territories. At first, Anne believed these stories, but when no letters came, no word at all, her fear grew. She described how the twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, were always there, silent and cold, helping with the rituals and keeping constant watch. They moved like shadows in the hallways, pale eyes always fixed on someone, and the children lived in fear of being chosen. Martha was not the only parent plagued by unease. Thomas Fletcher, whose 13-year-old son Benjamin had reportedly died of consumption in October, had his own doubts. The last letter he received from Benjamin was nothing like the boy's usual notes. It was filled with ideas and phrases far beyond the understanding of a farm boy who only months before had barely been able to spell his own name. In it, Benjamin spoke of advanced lessons of learning secrets that would prepare him for God's service and of being chosen for a special purpose. Days after that letter, Thomas was told of Benjamin's death. When he visited the grave at Prairie View, something felt wrong. The earth was loosely packed. The wooden cross was fresh and rough, as if made just days earlier, not weeks. Worse still, when he asked Dr. Ezra Coleman, the traveling physician for the region, about Benjamin's final illness. The doctors said he had never once been called to examine Benjamin or any other sick child at Prairie View. The Kensingtons had always claimed to handle sickness themselves, using herbal remedies and prayer, a practice Cornelius attributed to knowledge gained during his seminary years. While frontier families often relied on home care for minor ailments, serious illnesses almost always brought a summons to a circuit physician. That was why Thomas Fletcher was deeply unsettled when Dr. Coleman told him that not once had the Kensingtons requested his help, not for Benjamin nor for any other student who had supposedly died under their care. Combined with the increasingly suspicious circumstances surrounding Benjamin's letter and burial, this revelation pushed Fletcher to start asking more questions. Others had been observing as well. Jacob Winters, a solitary trapper, familiar with every sound and shadow of the frontier, had long suspected that something was wrong on the hill where Prairie View stood. on nights when most families slept and the academy should have been still. Winters saw chimney smoke rising, though the weather was warm. He saw candlelight burning long before dawn. More than once he heard muffled digging behind the chapel. At first he assumed it was burial work, until he noticed that some graves were barely large enough for a small child. Others so shallow they seemed hastily covered. When he once mentioned this casually to Cornelius Kensington at the general store, the man's immediate defensive anger, followed by a clumsy explanation about burying family pets, only deepened Winters' misgivings. Over time, he also noticed unsettling changes in the students he met along the trails. Children who had once been chatty and bright began returning to their homes, pale and silent, their eyes downcast. They seemed subdued, even fearful. Most chilling were the times Winters encountered the twins Jeremiah and Josiah in the woods at night. He had seen them loading heavy sacks into wagons, burying something behind the chapel, and watching the forest edges like guards. By the end of 1812, parents began whispering to one another, comparing letters, stories, and observations. Anne Prescott's terrifying account of the basement ceremonies provided context for all these fragments. Combined with Thomas Fletcher's doubts and Winters' warnings, a grim picture began to form. Yet even as the evidence mounted, no one dared to confront the Kensingtons directly. They were respected. They had built the only school for miles, and in a frontier community, making such accusations without proof could destroy a family. The bitter winter of 1812 to 1813 brought snow that isolated Prairie View. Most parents could not travel, leaving only a few boarding students in the academy. That isolation seemed to make the Kensingtons careless. In the safety of her home, Anne's nightmares grew worse. Night after night she awoke screaming, and gradually, under gentle questioning, the full horror spilled out. She described covenant ceremonies that took place beneath the school. In a stone-walled chapel beneath the basement, Cornelius gathered chosen children around an altar he said was blessed by angels. They were given a bitter drink that left them drowsy and unable to resist. She remembered standing beside the cold stone, unable to move, while Cornelius prayed over them, chanting in strange words that sounded like Latin, and the twins echoed him in unison. Matilda sat at a small organ playing slow, mournful music. Then always the chosen child disappeared. They never came back. Anne's memories were hazy from the drug, but she recalled the choking smell of herbs and smoke, the touch of the stone altar, and the certainty that something final happened there. She spoke of hidden doors in the basement, narrow tunnels that led to locked rooms where children were taken for correction. She had seen these places, and her descriptions of the beams, the stones, and the drainage channels matched the layout so precisely that no one doubted her. While Martha Prescott tended to her traumatized daughter, other parents began their own quiet investigations. Thomas Fletcher examined his son's grave with an iron rod and found no coffin, only loose soil and debris. Other graves were the same. The ground was freshly turned, the crosses new, and none of them showed the settling that old burials should have. It was as if every death had been staged. The most chilling confirmation came from Dr. Ezra Coleman during a winter visit to a distant settlement. While treating a family for influenza, he met Sarah Henderson, a young woman who had spent a few months working as a servant at the academy. When he asked her about her time there, she told him things that would soon shatter the Kensington family's carefully maintained facade. Sarah Henderson's testimony was the first real glimpse into what outsiders never saw at Prairie View Academy. Hired as a servant for the busy summer term, she lasted barely 3 weeks before fleeing in fear. At first she admired the Kensingtons' apparent dedication and the polite, orderly behavior of their students. But it didn't take long to see that this order was enforced by something far darker. The children were unnaturally subdued, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting punishment. The twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, were everywhere silent as ghosts, watching not just the students, but even the staff. Most troubling were the nights. Henderson heard things no prayer meeting could explain: low chanting, crying, furniture scraping on stone. When she asked Matilda about it, she was told the family held special guidance sessions for children who needed extra spiritual care. Henderson knew better. Then came the moment that made her run. Cleaning the basement, she found dried blood on the stones and strange metal instruments far too precise for animal care, as Cornelius claimed. Soon after, she stumbled on a concealed door behind a loose stone wall. Inside was a hidden chamber with shackles bolted to the walls and implements she didn't dare study too closely. She fled, but not before the Kensingtons cornered her, dismissed her on the spot, and warned her never to speak of what she had seen. Henderson's testimony confirmed Anne Prescott's whispered nightmares and emboldened other parents to compare what they knew. Then in February 1813, an outsider finally witnessed something that forced action. Caught in a snowstorm 2 miles from Prairie View, a traveling merchant named Marcus Webb took shelter in an abandoned cabin. Through the swirling snow, he saw figures carrying lanterns back and forth between the academy and the woods. They hauled heavy sacks, digging into the frozen earth in places that had clearly been disturbed before. Webb, a meticulous observer by trade, noted the locations and details, and when the weather cleared, he reported everything to territorial officials in Kaskaskia. Unlike locals, Webb had no ties to the Kensingtons, and his reliable reputation gave his account weight. The stories now formed a damning pattern: Anne's first-hand account, Sarah Henderson's terrifying observations, Thomas Fletcher's discoveries in the cemetery, Jacob Winters's reports of strange night work, and Marcus Webb's description of midnight digging. Together they finally pushed the territorial authorities to act. Sheriff Captain James Mitchell was a veteran of the harsh frontier. He had dealt with raids, feuds, and murders, but nothing like this, a case where the accused were a family praised for their piety and their school. Still, the evidence was overwhelming. Mitchell assembled a team: Deputy William Crawford, an ex-soldier experienced with organized crime, Dr. Ezra Coleman, whose medical expertise would be vital, and Reverend Samuel Hayes, the Methodist circuit preacher, to give moral authority. On April 15, 1813, they rode out under the guise of a routine inspection. The academy sat on its hill, silent and still, where once there had been the lively sounds of lessons and laughter. There was now only stillness. No children's voices, no figures in the windows. Only the distant barking of dogs as the investigators approached, unaware of the nightmare they were about to uncover. Cornelius Kensington greeted Sheriff Mitchell and his team at the gate with his usual polished manners. But years of frontier law enforcement had trained Mitchell to recognize cracks in a facade. Cornelius's handshake trembled, his forehead glistened with sweat despite the cool April air, and his eyes kept drifting nervously toward the cemetery. "Captain Mitchell," he said with forced cheerfulness, "what an unexpected pleasure. To what do we owe this visit? I trust the territorial government has finally recognized our mission and is here to discuss support." Mitchell, calm and deliberate, explained that their visit was part of a general review of mortality at frontier schools. He emphasized the need for records regarding student deaths and burials. The explanation sounded routine, but their presence was entirely focused on Prairie View and the thick stack of troubling testimonies that had led them there. Cornelius's confident smile faltered. He claimed all documentation had been lost, In a fire over the winter, a fire started, he said by a tipped candle during evening prayers. The excuse rang hollow. Dr. Coleman, who had served countless frontier communities, knew how fiercely such records were guarded. They did not vanish so conveniently. At the cemetery, the team's suspicions turned to certainty. Several graves, supposedly months old, had fresh disturbances. Using a metal probe, Dr. Coleman confirmed what Thomas Fletcher had already discovered beneath the loose soil. Were no coffins, no bodies, only rocks and debris. Matilda wrung her hands, stammering about wild animals and the need to move the remains, but the disturbed earth and clean, fresh markers told a different story. Inside the academy, things grew even stranger. The classrooms looked staged, desks, too neat, materials barely touched. Dormitories were tidy, but lifeless, with no evidence of the everyday chaos of dozens of children living together. It was a building that had been scrubbed clean of its true purpose. Mitchell pressed to search the basement, and the Kensingtons' composure broke. They insisted the area was unstable, used only for storage. Cornelius's voice grew strained. Matilda pleaded, and the twins simply stood at the foot of the stairs like pale statues. Ignoring their protests, the investigators pressed on. It was Deputy Crawford who noticed the false wall, a section of masonry that concealed a narrow door. The hidden rooms behind it revealed a side of the academy no one outside had ever seen. Rough stone corridors led to chambers containing shackles-stained wooden tables and implements that had no place in a school. Matilda fell apart, alternating between screaming at the officers to stop and begging them not to desecrate what she called sacred spaces. Cornelius spoke of divine missions and sacrifice as the price of salvation, his words spilling out in a fevered torrent. And the twins, silent still, with eyes that betrayed no emotion, watched it all as though they had been waiting for this moment. Mitchell, hardened by years of frontier crime, felt a cold weight settle in his chest. This was no isolated act of cruelty, but a system planned, deliberate, and hidden behind piety. On April 16, 1813, as they sealed off the hidden chambers, he arrested the Kensington family. At first the charges were fraud and conspiracy, but all of them knew that these were only the beginning. Then, as the family was being transported to Kaskaskia, an unexpected voice gave them the key to the full horror. 11-year-old Rebecca Hawthorne, a recent boarder who had returned home weeks earlier, spoke up after hearing of the arrests. In her parents' cabin with Mitchell present, she unburdened herself. Rebecca's account began with the daily routine: silent hallways, watchful twins, and a constant oppressive sense that someone was always listening. Children learn to obey to be invisible. Disobedience brought not just punishment, but a slow grinding away of the will until the brightest among them became pale, timid shadows of themselves. She described a hierarchy where obedience earned privileges, while independence marked you for something far worse. The chosen were called down to the basement chapel for what they believed was an honor covenant ceremonies, advanced lessons for the most faithful. The reality was different. In that stone-walled chamber, under the cold gaze of the twins, Cornelius led prayers that promised transformation. Bitter drinks made the children weak and confused. Then came the prayers, the chanting, the slow parade of ritual. And after the ceremony, the chosen children never returned. Rebecca's voice faltered as she described the smell of herbs and smoke, the feel of the altar's cold stone, and the absolute certainty that those who went below would not come back. Her words confirmed everything Anne Prescott had whispered, everything Sarah Henderson had seen, and everything the investigators had begun to suspect. Prairie View Academy was never a sanctuary for learning. It was a trap, and the horrors waiting in those hidden chambers were about to be revealed in full. Rebecca's testimony brought the horror into focus with terrifying clarity. She described one covenant ceremony she had witnessed in February of 1813, centered on a 13-year-old boy named Peter Caldwell. Peter, a bright and gifted student from a settlement 50 miles away, had been chosen for advanced instruction, a supposed honor. Excited and proud, he believed this selection was a reward for his talent and faith. That night the weather was harsh, keeping all but the chosen few confined indoors. Cornelius led the ceremony in the basement chapel with prayers, hymns, and readings before giving Peter a bitter herbal drink, claiming it would cleanse his soul. The mixture left Peter weak and unable to resist as the ceremony moved into a hidden stone chamber, lit by dozens of candles. Rebecca described the room in detail. An altar carved with strange symbols, the twins standing silent at either side, and Matilda playing a slow dirge on a small harmonium. Then the ritual turned into torture, disguised as a spiritual trial. Peter's cries of pain were reinterpreted as prayers, his pleas for mercy dismissed as tests of faith. The torment lasted for hours. Rebecca could still hear him calling for his parents before he finally collapsed. Cornelius then declared Peter ready for transcendence. According to Rebecca, Peter did not die that night. She heard his faint voice for several days afterward, hidden away in the chamber, while the Kensingtons told the rest of the students that he had been sent on a mission to spread God's word. On the last night Rebecca spent at the academy, she crept from her dormitory and peered through a gap in the floorboards. There she saw Jeremiah and Josiah carrying Peter's lifeless body out of the chamber, preparing it for disposal. This testimony guided Sheriff Mitchell's expanded investigation. Backed by a larger team of deputies and officials, he searched every part of the academy. The hidden chamber Rebecca described was found exactly where she said, containing a cold stone altar, symbols carved into the walls, shackles for restraining children, and a floor stained with human blood. The room left no doubt these rituals were a cover for systematic torture and murder. Guided by Rebecca's memories and Marcus Webb's earlier report of digging, investigators uncovered shallow graves in the woods behind the academy. 15 small bodies were found. Each showed signs of abuse, mutilation, and prolonged suffering. Some graves contained dismembered remains, others were marked by stones arranged in strange patterns. In Cornelius Kensington's study, journals documented every crime. Written in neat, careful handwriting, they revealed a belief that tortured children released divine energy that he could use to create a bridge between earth and heaven. He kept lists of the children's abilities, details of their suffering, and cold evaluations of their spiritual value. The journals also revealed the scheme's financial side. Tuition collected for murdered children, parents told their sons and daughters were on missions, while payments continued. With the money, the Kensingtons bought land books and religious trappings, sustaining their facade. The twins' involvement was unmistakable. In their quarters, investigators found trinkets taken from victims and crude drawings depicting the torture with a disturbing enthusiasm. Their father's writings made clear that they had become willing, eager participants. The Kensington trial began in September 1813 and quickly became the most infamous legal proceeding the territory had ever seen. To avoid mass panic, much of it was held behind closed doors. Judge William Harrison presided, while Attorney General Samuel Edwards led the prosecution with meticulous care. The evidence was so overwhelming that guilt was beyond doubt, but the sheer horror of the crimes tested the strength of the court. Cornelius Kensington remained unrepentant throughout, arguing that his victims had been elevated through their suffering, and that their families should feel gratitude rather than outrage. His words, spoken with complete conviction, revealed the full depth of his delusion and moral corruption. The trial would end with the destruction of the Kensington family, but the scars left on the frontier community and the families who had trusted them would never fully heal. Cornelius Kensington's testimony, delivered with the same calm pastoral tone he had once used to preach to the community, left everyone in the courtroom cold. He spoke with conviction of visions from God, of doctrines that demanded the sacrifice of children, and of rituals that he believed would prepare the world for a divine transformation. He showed no trace of guilt or remorse, insisting that his actions were holy. Many observers thought they were looking at a madman, but Dr. Coleman's expert testimony made clear that Cornelius knew right from wrong. His careful planning, secrecy, and deliberate deception proved he was fully responsible for his crimes, no matter how deluded. Matilda Kensington's defense was different, but no less disturbing. She claimed that she had been broken down over years of marriage, molded to obey Cornelius completely. She said she believed she was doing God's work and only followed orders. But testimony and letters revealed she had been deeply involved, selecting victims, manipulating families with false letters, and showing cruelty toward children who resisted. Rebecca Hawthorne testified that Matilda herself had chosen her for sacrifice and seemed to enjoy explaining how suffering brought children closer to God. The fabricated letters Matilda sent to grieving parents after their children were already dead showed a deliberate, calculating mind that understood exactly what she was doing. The twins Jeremiah and Josiah never spoke in their own defense. They communicated only in writing and sat motionless throughout the trial, their expressions blank. Witnesses described how they worshiped their father and carried out his instructions with fanatical obedience. Dr. Coleman testified that the two young men had been shaped so completely by Cornelius's control that they appeared to lack independent moral judgment or normal empathy. The trial's most haunting moment came when young Anne Prescott took the stand. Despite her age and the horror she had endured, her testimony was clear, detailed, and devastating. She confirmed Rebecca Hawthorne's accounts and gave further evidence about the hidden rooms, the rituals, and the deaths of other children. Everything she described, the layout of the chambers, the tools, and the order of the ceremonies, matched the physical evidence found during the investigation. All four members of the Kensington family were convicted on multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. The evidence was so overwhelming that the jury deliberated less than 2 hours. Judge Harrison sentenced them to death by hanging, scheduled for November 30th, 1813, in Kaskaskia. The executions were witnessed by hundreds of settlers. Cornelius used his last words to deliver a rambling sermon, claiming his death would bring divine retribution and that the murdered children would rise to punish those who had interfered with his mission. Matilda's final words were an apology, though many doubted her sincerity. The twins remained silent to the end. In the aftermath, Prairie View Academy was burned to the ground. By the families of its victims, the cemetery was declared defiled, and the children's remains were reburied in consecrated ground. The case left deep scars across the territory. Parents no longer trusted schools or teachers from outside their own communities, and the idea of sending children away became unthinkable. To protect the territory's reputation and prevent panic, officials sealed most records and suppressed details in newspapers. Many believe that the 15 confirmed victims were only part of a larger number, and that the Kensingtons' crimes may have begun years earlier in Pennsylvania. Those sealed records remain locked away, leaving the full scope of the Prairie View tragedy shrouded in secrecy. Families of the victims were left to grieve with the knowledge that their children's final moments had been spent in terror and suffering at the hands of those they had trusted most. Several parents abandoned Illinois forever, unable to stay in a land where every sound of children at play tore open their grief. Others sought a fragile peace by planting memorial gardens or funding small frontier churches as tributes to the sons and daughters they had lost. What the Kensington case revealed went far beyond the murders themselves. It exposed how vulnerable isolated frontier communities were to predators who could exploit trust, faith, and the desperate hunger for education. For 3 years, the Kensingtons thrived because there were no alternatives for learning, and because survival on the frontier required neighbors to trust one another without question. What makes this case most terrifying is how close it came to going on forever. If not for a few crucial acts, Martha Prescott's instinct to pull her daughter from the school, Anne's courage to speak through fear, Rebecca Hawthorne's refusal to stay silent, and the resolve of grieving parents to challenge authority, the Kensington family might have continued murdering for decades, spreading their network to other settlements. The psychological damage stretched far beyond those who lost children. Communities now knew that evil could hide behind a preacher's words and a teacher's books, using faith and learning as masks. Where once trust bound neighbors together, suspicion replaced it. Boarding schools and traveling teachers became symbols of risk, not hope. The growth of education in Illinois was set back for a generation as families chose to keep their children close, even if it meant they would grow up illiterate. This case remains a brutal lesson in how predators exploit society's noblest aspirations. It is a warning about the danger of power without oversight. Cornelius Kensington's religious and educational credentials gave him complete authority over his pupils' authority that no one questioned until it was too late. Above all, it shows the importance of listening to children. The letters Anne wrote, the warnings Rebecca whispered, were full of truths that the adults around them could not see because they trusted too easily. And even now, questions remain. The official suppression of the records means we will never know whether all the Kensington crimes were uncovered, or if other victims remain hidden, erased from memory, just as their graves were erased from the earth. Do you believe everything about this family's evil was revealed? Or could there have been more victims, more settlements whose stories we will never know? Should the territorial officials have hidden the truth for fear of panic, or should every fact have been laid bare as a warning? How different might the history of frontier education have been if these horrors had been fully exposed? Share your thoughts below. And if this dark chapter has left you wanting more, subscribe, ring the bell, and join us for our next story, the traveling preacher who left a trail of vanished families across 3 states, and the federal marshal who spent 10 years hunting him through the wilderness. The Prairie View Academy is long gone. Its graves moved, its walls burned to ash. But the questions it raises about trust and authority linger to this day. Even in a modern world full of background checks and oversight, we would be wise to remember some of the most dangerous monsters are those who appear most holy, most educated, and most worthy of trust. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.